Okay, let's just jump right in. We're going to break down what was, by any measure, a wild day in American politics. January 15th, 2026. Here's a look at what went down.
So the day starts with this. Just, wow. A post on social media from the president himself, and it's a direct threat to a U.S. state and its elected officials, not something you see every day.
So what is the Insurrection Act? You've probably heard the term, but what does it actually do? Well, it's this really old, really powerful law that basically gives the president the authority to use the military right here on U.S. soil for law enforcement. It's a huge deal because there are normally laws that strictly forbid that.
All right, so here's our game plan. We'll start with the threat itself, then zoom in on what's happening in Minnesota. After that, we'll pull back to see the bigger pattern here, how it's affecting democratic institutions, and finally, what important stories are getting totally buried in all this chaos.
Okay, first up, that threat to use the Insurrection Act. I mean, how on earth did we get to this point?
And that brings us right to Minnesota, which has really become the center of this whole storm.
Look at how fast this all happened. It's really just been a week. It all kicks off when an ICE agent shoots and kills Renee Good, a 37-year-old mom. The administration's response? They immediately label her and her wife domestic terrorists. Then, just last night, things escalate again. A federal agent wounds someone else in Minneapolis, and that leads to clashes with protesters. And that brings us to this morning, with the president threatening to bring in the troops. It's just a whirlwind.
And here's where things get really interesting. You've got two completely different stories being told. The administration's public reason for all this is that they're fighting the Tren de Aragua gang, which they call a highly structured terrorist organization. But U.S. intelligence says something totally different. They see it as fragmented, low-level crime, and we're even questioning if the gang was really operating in the U.S. back in 2025. That's a massive disconnect.
And you can see how this is playing out with the public. Whatever the administration is saying, it doesn't seem to be landing. A full 50% of people disapprove of ICE's recent actions, while only 30% approve. That's a 20-point gap. It suggests an issue that might have been a political winner before is now turning into a real problem.
And behind all these political battles and statistics, you have real people getting caught in the middle. Just listen to this from a mother whose family, 6 kids, including a baby, got hit with tear gas. She said, "My kids were innocent. I was innocent. My husband was innocent. This shouldn't have happened. We were just trying to go home." It really grounds the whole situation, doesn't it?
So what's the state's response? Well, Minnesota's governor, Tim Walz, is basically trying to walk a tightrope. On one hand, he's pleading with the federal government to just turn the temperature down. But on the other hand, he's telling citizens to peacefully film ICE agents to, in his words, bank evidence for future prosecution. So he's de-escalating while also preparing for a legal fight.
All right, so let's zoom out a bit. Because what's happening in Minnesota isn't happening in a vacuum. It seems to fit into a broader pattern of escalation, moving from just immigration policy to a wider effort to suppress opponents.
And you can really see this pattern playing out on 3 different fronts. First, against citizens. We're now hearing that federal agents are asking people for proof of citizenship if they're just near an alleged crime. Second, you have the press. The FBI actually raided the home of a Washington Post reporter, taking her phone, her laptops, even her watch. And third, just direct dissent. The president was at a factory, someone heckled him, and his response was, well, fuck you. So you see it. Citizens, press, dissent, all being targeted.
And this pattern goes even deeper, now starting to target the very foundations of our democratic institutions.
I mean, listen to this. In a recent interview, the president started openly questioning the whole idea of elections. He said it's some deep psychological thing, but when you win the presidency, you don't win the midterms. When you think of it, we shouldn't even have an election. To suggest just not having an election, that's a pretty big step.
And at the same time, we're seeing a move against the independence of the country's financial system. The Department of Justice has actually opened a criminal investigation into Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve. This is such an unusual move that even Senate Republicans are speaking out against it.
Then there's this whole other situation with money. About $500 million from seized Venezuelan oil. The U.S. sold the oil, but now the money is sitting in an offshore account in Qatar. The president is claiming he has personal control over it, and that prompted Senator Elizabeth Warren to say, there is no basis in law for a president to set up an offshore account that he controls. That is precisely a move that a corrupt politician would be attracted to.
So, with all of this going on,
this whirlwind of activity, you have to ask, what's getting lost in all the noise?
Well, there are at least two other huge stories that are just struggling to get any attention. First, the Epstein files. The DOJ was legally required to release them, but they've only put out less than 1% of the documents, and it's all gotten bogged down in partisan fighting. And second, that Venezuelan oil money we just talked about, $500 million sitting offshore with the president claiming control and a ton of unanswered questions.
And that really leaves us with this final, crucial question. When the political world feels like it's in a state of constant crisis, with one fire breaking out after another, what are we all missing? What are the really important long-term stories that are happening just off camera, getting completely lost in the noise?